Welcome to our Draw My Life Romanticism edition. The term Romanticism was coined in 1798 by German writer and poet Friedrich von Schlegel when he first applied it to poetry. Romanticism later expanded into an entirely new genre within Western art. Romanticism was a movement that emphasized individuality, encouraging artists to abandon logic and follow their genius and imagination wherever it led them. This direction could lead anywhere from the past to the exotic present, the most grotesque and horrific aspects of human behavior, and the awesome forces of nature. Artists were swept away by powerful emotions of God's presence and personal experiences, as well as liberty and freedom, a shift towards democracy. Romanticism was not necessarily a style, but simply an attitude. In this, painting is most associated with Romanticism. Although the most well-known Romantic paintings are Baroque in that painting was handled dramatically and showcased energetic compositions, Romantic paintings were just as readily closely painted and composed in alignment with neoclassical ideas, ending in preserved images conveying powerful emotions.
Hey everyone, let's talk about Francis Goya. Francis Goya was a painter originally from Spain. His life tells an interesting story as his painterly works would go on to influence subsequent artists for decades to come. Although his painterly style embodies the style of Romanticism, the artist that he would go on to influence would span several different artistic movements. So, let's talk about the background of Francis Goya. Goya was born in Spain and would begin his artistic training at the famed Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Madrid. His primary mentor and instructor would be the painter Antoine Raphael Mengs. It was under Mengs that Francis would develop his artistic talent through a diligent study of painting and would also have the opportunity to work on tapestries for the Royal Tapestry Workshop, which was located near the Academy of Fine Arts. This position at the Royal Tapestry Workshop gave Goya a reason to remain in Madrid. And since Francis was already located in Madrid, and considering how compelling Goya's tapestries were, King Charles III would go on to appoint Francis Goya to become the official court painter for the Royal Spanish Court. Around the time of the fall of the French Revolution, France went to war with Spain. Now, during this time, 1793 to be exact, Francis Goya became mysteriously ill, and there was no real cause as to what caused this illness. Although he did survive this illness, he mysteriously went deaf in the process. Seems very suspicious. I think now is a good time to discuss the content of Francis Goya's paintings. Now, obviously dealing with war and whatnot, he had some different ideas just caused by the different events he had lived through, such as war and such as illness. So Goya's artwork is usually surrounded by the psychological exposure of misery and death. That's kind of like a main theme in his work. He explores the human condition and its fragility. His work explores the cruelty, tension, all these different aspects related to war. And then the reality of death and the unknown void remained a constant in his artwork. Example of his work like The Sleep of Reason. Now, this work in particular explores a perspective of what the world is like without the enlightenment that logic holds to us. Nightmarish depictions like this emphasize his dramatic approach to artwork. The psychological merges with the emotional in Francis Goya's work. Goya also painted The Family of Charles, which is a more real work depicting the family of Charles. Now, in this painting, Francis Goya is exposing the humanness of the family and not necessarily their superiority. Another example of a work of Francis Goya is The 3rd of May, which was completed by Francis Goya in the year 1814. Now, this painting contains a composition which creates a very tragic and fearful tone. He Here's why. The painting depicts the mass slaughter of the Spanish freedom fighters who were ordered to be executed under Napoleon. So to recap, Francis Goya was a Spanish Romantic painter who lived from 1746 to 1828. His works are breathtaking as they deal with mainly human and psychological themes. Overall, Francis Goya is considered to be the most important Spanish artist during the late 18th to early 19th century. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and move on to our next artist.
One example of an artist who worked in this fashion was the British landscape artist John Constable, who was born in 1776 in East Bergholt, Suffolk. He grew up in the countryside, surrounded by peaceful farmlands and fields. This environment served as a positive influence on Constable's childhood and left lasting impressions on him throughout his lifetime. As he grew older, he began to explore art through drawing the scenery around his home. While his artistic career was not encouraged in rural Suffolk, Constable followed his passions and went to study at the Royal Academy in London. This was a dramatic shift from where Constable grew up. Instead of being surrounded by rolling hills and peaceful rivers, he was now in a bustling, crowded city. This did not stop Constable from learning everything he could. While at the academy, he learned to paint scientifically and even exhibited artwork there. However, Constable decided to return to the countryside and pursue his interests in nature and landscapes. Constable's work is largely made up of his landscape paintings from his childhood home. He preferred to paint locally as opposed to abroad and focus on more everyday scenery. The subject matter of his art made it more controversial at the time, because many people still believed that art had to have a noble subject matter. And here was Constable, painting in a realistic sense of life. But the way he painted these scenes captures the emotions tied to this land, and how he paints these landscapes with such careful consideration. One work of Constable's that captures this is the Hay Wain, painted in 1821. This scene shows a landscape of a horse and wagon wading through the water, with a mill in the background. There are figures riding in the wagon as well as a dog in the front of the picture. Then Constable leads the viewer's eyes back to the landscape that recedes into a distant tree line. This painting displays a very average and modest scenery, but because Constable pays so much attention to it and treats it like a higher subject matter, it makes it feel as such. Another notable work of Constable's is a landscape titled Wivenhoe Park, Sussex, from 1816. This one also has a modest subject matter of cows grazing next to a pond, while two fishermen occupy the lower area of the painting. This painting also shows Constable's attention to detail and how he can paint everyday subject matter in a way that emphasizes the beauty in the countryside. John Constable's impact in romantic art, and even the art world in general, was very significant. He led artists to act on their emotions and desire to paint subject matter that was important to the artist rather than the viewer. He demonstrated a new way of painting landscapes that was not relating to the idealized subject that most of the classical art did, but through a realistic representation of life and the beauty that can be found in it. Constable showed that landscapes do not have to be grandiose, but can depict ordinary scenery and still be called a work of art.
The next artist we come to is Joseph Mallord William Turner. Turner was born in the year 1775. Turner began his career as a freelance topographical watercolorist in the early 1790s. By 1799, Turner became an associate of the Royal Academy. Comparing artists like John Constable to Turner, the two could not be further apart. Turner aspired to rival great history painting. He also invested in his views a rich overlay of historical motifs, referencing the old masters and conveying metaphorical themes. Turner's work was often cataclysmic in that it portrayed the horrific and the powerful, as well as the uncontrollable forces of nature, all of this giving reference to sublime imagery. Through his studies of landscapes, Turner's goal was to outdo the old masters, to push the extent of atmospheric qualities and achieve more of the emotion of landscape art. Because of this, the genre of historical landscapes was created. One of his landscapes in particular, Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps, conveys the previously mentioned qualities. Turner puts forth the weather of the event at the forefront of the scene. Turner also uses dramatic lighting, atmospheric landscape, and a receding vortex as the main and strongest aspects of the painting. Through his work, Turner's overall goal was that the romantic notion of making a viewer feel nature's unfathomable enormity, not to reproduce a landscape. Joseph Mallord William Turner.
From Goya's nightmarish pieces of a theatrical nature, to Constable's beautifully picturesque landscapes, to Turner's historical and detailed landscapes, each are romantic artists, but are so different and unique to their work. The Romantic art period of history was a time of true beauty and emotion. The Romantic artists felt that the most important aspect of art was the emotional impact of the piece itself. Francisco Goya chose to communicate the feelings of characters and figures and how they themselves felt. John Constable chose to show emotion in simple countryside landscapes, of roads and fields. Joseph Mallord William Turner wanted to communicate the emotional weight of historical figures and landscapes. Each of these artists decided to show, in different ways, how they wanted the viewer to experience an emotional response to their pieces. In the words of Romantic writer Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, "All the knowledge I possess, everyone else can acquire, but my heart is all my own."